In the spring of 1847, somewhere along the marshy coastline between South Carolina and Georgia, authorities discovered 17 bodies floating in the Savannah River. Within 6 weeks, that number climbed to 43. By autumn, local newspapers stopped publishing the exact count, citing only additional casualties in their reports. What they didn't tell the public was that every single victim bore identical marks, a specific pattern of wounds that suggested the same hand, the same method, the same executioner. Court records from Charleston, buried in basement archives for over a century, reveal something even more disturbing. Witnesses consistently described a man who simply vanished after each incident, leaving no trail, no evidence, no explanation. Confederate military correspondence from 1863 mentions him again, 16 years later, still active, still uncaught. By the time Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, the estimated death toll attributed to this single individual exceeded 200 white men, plantation owners, overseers, slave catchers, merchants, and at least one federal marshal. No arrest was ever made, no body was ever found. And perhaps most unsettling of all, multiple sources suggest that hundreds of enslaved people knew exactly who he was, yet not a single one ever spoke his name to authorities. Before we continue with the story of the man they called the River Ghost, I need you to do something. If this already sounds impossible to you, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about American history. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from right now? The truth is, this story doesn't begin with violence. It begins with a transaction, recorded in fading ink on yellowed paper, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society's climate-controlled archives. On March 12, 1831, a slave auction took place outside the courthouse in Savannah, Georgia. The morning air was thick with humidity, carrying the smell of the nearby marshlands mixed with the sweat of terrified human beings lined up for sale. According to the ledger, a 23-year-old man identified only as Samuel, field hand, sound constitution, no visible defects, was sold for $800 to a rice plantation owner named Thaddeus Claymore. The sale was unremarkable in every way. Samuel stood on the auction block alongside 14 others that morning, all recently arrived from a failed tobacco farm in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. The auctioneer, a portly man named Hutchins, who'd been conducting sales for 15 years, noted Samuel's height, over 6 feet, unusual for the time, and his build, which suggested years of heavy field work. He mentioned Samuel's teeth were good, his back bore the scars of previous whippings, but showed no recent wounds, and he moved with the mechanical obedience of someone who'd learned not to resist. What Hutchins didn't note, because he had no reason to suspect it, was that Samuel could read. Not just simple words, but complex texts. Not just English, but the Gula language spoken by coastal slaves, and enough Creek and Seminole to communicate with the indigenous peoples who still moved through the southern swamps like ghosts of a previous era. Samuel had learned these skills over years of careful observation, listening to conversations he wasn't supposed to hear, studying maps when overseers weren't watching, memorizing the routes that slave catchers used, the locations of patrols, the rhythms of plantation life. He'd learned to be invisible while seeing everything. Thaddeus Claymore was a third-generation rice planter, born into wealth that his grandfather had built on the backs of enslaved labor. His plantation, called Riverbend, sat on 4,000 acres of prime rice-growing land, where the Savannah River bent sharply inland, creating a natural irrigation system that made the property extraordinarily valuable. The estate employed 260 enslaved people, making it one of the largest operations in the Georgia Lowcountry. Claymore himself was a refined man by the standards of his class. He'd been educated at the College of Charleston, had traveled to Europe twice, collected books on agriculture and philosophy, and considered himself a progressive thinker who treated his property humanely. He didn't beat his slaves without cause, he argued. He provided adequate food and shelter. He even allowed them to marry and maintain family units, believing it made them more productive and less likely to run. What Claymore didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that you cannot make bondage humane. You cannot enslave a human being kindly. And some men, when stripped of everything, don't break, they sharpen. Rice cultivation in the Georgia Lowcountry was brutal work that required intricate knowledge and back-breaking labor. The fields had to be flooded and drained according to precise schedules, requiring a network of canals, dikes, levees, and floodgates that controlled water flow from the river. Enslaved workers spent their days waist-deep in stagnant water under the merciless Georgia sun, planting, weeding, and harvesting rice, while battling clouds of mosquitoes that bred in the standing water. The work bred malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, and a dozen other diseases. Medical records from the period show that 40% of enslaved people at Riverbend died before reaching age 30. The plantation went through workers the way a mill goes through grain, purchasing new slaves every year to replace those who died or become too sick to work. Samuel arrived at Riverbend in chains on March 15, 1831, along with 6 others from the same Virginia estate. They were marched through the main gate, past the whitewashed plantation house with its columned portico, past the overseer's cottage and the stables, down to the slave quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins arranged in neat rows behind the work buildings. Samuel was assigned to the 3rd gang, the lowest tier of field workers, reserved for new arrivals or those being punished. The gang was supervised by a man named Nathaniel Boone, an overseer who'd worked at Riverbend for 8 years and had earned a reputation for efficiency. Boone carried a braided leather whip coiled at his belt and used it liberally on anyone who worked too slowly or showed the slightest hint of resistance. For the first weeks, Samuel did exactly what was expected of him. He woke before dawn when the horn sounded. He ate his ration of cornmeal and salt pork. He worked in the rice fields from sunrise to sunset, planting seedlings in the flooded paddies, his back bent, his hands raw from the work. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his eyes down, showed no emotion. To Boone and the other overseers, Samuel was just another pair of hands, indistinguishable from the dozens of other men laboring in the fields. But Samuel was learning. Every day, he memorized a little more. The layout of the plantation, the rotation schedules of the overseers, which fields were worked when, where the patrol roads ran, how the water moved through the canal system, where the property boundaries lay, which areas were densely wooded, where the swamps began. He learned which overseers were lazy and which were vigilant. He learned their habits, their routines, their weaknesses. He learned to move through Riverbend as if he were part of the landscape itself. And he waited. For 3 years and 4 months, Samuel simply disappeared into the machinery of plantation life. He became part of the background, unremarkable and overlooked. Other slaves came and went. Some died, some were sold, some ran and were caught and punished. But Samuel remained, patient and observant, biding his time like a hunter in tall grass. Then, on August 4th, 1834, everything changed. The first person to die was an overseer named Horace Gaffney, and his death seemed at first like nothing more than a tragic accident. It happened during harvest season, when the rice was at its peak and every hand was needed in the fields. Gaffney had been inspecting the lower paddies near the eastern boundary of the plantation, an area where the canals ran particularly deep and the banks were steep and slippery with mud. According to the report filed with the county sheriff, Gaffney had been walking along the embankment of a drainage canal when he apparently lost his footing on the muddy slope. He'd tumbled down the bank and struck his head on one of the heavy wooden sluice gates that controlled water flow. His body was discovered 2 hours later by a slave named Marcus, face down in 8 inches of stagnant water, his skull fractured, blood mixing with the brown canal water. The plantation physician, a doctor named Thornbury who visited Riverbend twice a week, examined the body and ruled it an accidental drowning. Gaffney had slipped, hit his head, and fallen into the water unconscious. It was a plausible explanation. The canal banks were treacherous, especially during harvest when they were kept flooded. Men had fallen before. Thornbury noted the location and manner of death in his ledger, collected his fee, and that was that. Thaddeus Claymore was disturbed by Gaffney's death. He'd employed the man for 6 years and considered him reliable, but he accepted the physician's verdict. Accidents happened on plantations. The work was dangerous. Men fell from horses, were kicked by mules, were struck by falling timber, drowned in irrigation ditches. Death was simply part of the cost of doing business. Claymore ordered Samuel and 5 other slaves to dig a grave near the property line in the small cemetery where slaves and overseers were buried in separate sections. They lowered Gaffney into the ground on a humid August afternoon while flies buzzed in the thick air. What Claymore didn't know, what the physician never discovered, was that Horace Gaffney hadn't slipped. He'd been pushed, and the hands that had pushed him, that had held his head under the water until his struggles ceased, belonged to Samuel. 6 weeks later, a second overseer disappeared, and this time there wasn't even a body to examine. Benjamin Stokes was a younger man, only 26, who'd been working at Riverbend for less than a year. He'd come from a smaller plantation in the South Carolina interior and was still learning the rhythms of rice cultivation. On the evening of September 19, 1834, Stokes left the overseer's cottage to make his final rounds through the slave quarters, a routine check to ensure everyone was accounted for before nightfall. The sun had set, but there was enough twilight remaining to see by. Stokes carried a lantern and a pistol, standard equipment for evening patrols. He never returned. When Stokes failed to appear for breakfast the following morning, the other overseers organized a search party. They combed the plantation grounds, calling his name, checking the fields, the woods, the canals. They searched the slave quarters, questioning every person they encountered. They followed the patrol routes Stokes would have taken. They dragged sections of the river. They sent riders to check the roads leading away from the property. For 5 days, they searched. They found nothing. No body, no clothes, no sign of struggle, no indication of where Stokes had gone or what had happened to him. After a week, Claymore declared him a runaway, though the explanation made no sense. Overseers didn't abandon steady employment and decent wages. They didn't vanish without taking their possessions or their horse. Some whispered that Stokes had gotten himself into gambling debts in Savannah and had fled his creditors. Others suggested he'd been drunk and had wandered into the river and drowned, his body carried downstream. A few wondered if one of the slaves had killed him, but without a body or evidence, there was no way to investigate. The mystery went unsolved. Claymore hired a replacement, and life at Riverbend continued. But in the slave quarters, in the conversations that happened after dark when the overseers had retired, people began to talk. Marcus, the man who'd found Gaffney's body, mentioned to a few trusted friends that he'd seen Samuel near the lower canals that day, around the time Gaffney would have been making his inspection. A woman named Letty said she'd seen Samuel returning to his cabin late one evening, his clothes wet, his hands muddy, around the time Stokes had disappeared. None of them reported these observations to the overseers. They didn't even discuss them openly. But a quiet understanding began to spread through the enslaved community at Riverbend. Something had changed. Someone was fighting back. Then came the third death. And this time there were witnesses who couldn't be ignored. On November 19, 1834, an overseer named Luther Pettigrew was supervising a work gang in one of the remote rice fields near the northwestern corner of the plantation. It was late afternoon, the sun angling low through the cypress trees that lined the field's perimeter. Pettigrew was a harsh man, known for his quick temper and quicker whip. He'd been at Riverbend for 3 years and had developed a reputation for brutality that made even the other overseers uncomfortable. Enslaved workers feared assignment to Pettigrew's gang, knowing that mistakes, no matter how small, would be met with physical punishment. According to the testimony later given to the county constable, Pettigrew had been standing near one of the main irrigation canals, shouting orders at the workers spread across the field. A slave named Cyrus was working about 30 yards away when he heard Pettigrew's voice suddenly rise in alarm, followed by a loud splash. Cyrus looked up to see Pettigrew in the canal, thrashing in the water. The overseer's arms flailed, his head went under, came up gasping, went under again. Cyrus dropped his tools and ran toward the canal, along with 3 other workers. But by the time they reached the edge, Pettigrew had disappeared beneath the brown surface. They dove in, searching frantically in the murky water. It took 20 minutes to locate Pettigrew's body, wedged against one of the submerged support posts of a floodgate. When they finally hauled him up onto the bank, it was immediately clear that something was wrong. Pettigrew's throat bore deep bruises, the kind that come from powerful hands squeezing with lethal intent. His face was purple, his eyes bulged, his mouth hung open. The men who pulled him from the water stood in shocked silence, water dripping from their clothes, staring at the unmistakable evidence before them. The county constable, a man named DeWitt, questioned every slave who'd been in the field that afternoon. He walked the canal bank, examining the scene, trying to reconstruct what had happened. But the more he investigated, the less sense it made. All the workers had been in plain sight of each other. No one had seen anyone approach Pettigrew. No one had seen him struggle with anyone. The only consistent detail in their testimonies was that they'd heard a shout, then a splash, and by the time they looked, Pettigrew was already in the water. Cyrus pressed harder than the others, finally offered a strange statement. "Something came out of the water," he said. DeWitt asked him to elaborate. Cyrus shook his head, his eyes distant. "I don't know what it was. One moment Mr. Pettigrew was standing on the bank shouting at us. The next, something just rose up from the canal. It happened too fast. By the time I looked, he was already under." DeWitt wrote down the statement but didn't know what to make of it. Something came out of the water. What did that mean? He questioned Cyrus repeatedly, trying to get a clearer description. But the man seemed genuinely shaken and couldn't provide more details. The other witnesses offered nothing helpful. They'd been looking down at their work. They'd only glanced up after hearing the splash. With no clear suspect and no witnesses who could identify an attacker, DeWitt closed the investigation. He noted in his report that Pettigrew had apparently been attacked and drowned by person or persons unknown. But without evidence, there was nothing more he could do. Claymore buried Pettigrew next to Gaffney in the Plantation cemetery and hired another overseer to replace him. But Cyrus's phrase, "something came out of the water," lingered in people's minds. It was repeated in whispers. It took on a life of its own, because it captured something essential about the killings. They seemed to come from nowhere. One moment everything was normal. The next, a man was dead, and no one ever saw it happen. 3 deaths in 4 months was unusual, certainly, but Claymore still didn't see a pattern. He told himself it was terrible luck, a coincidence, the kind of random tragedy that plagued plantations from time to time. He increased patrols, ordered the overseers to work in pairs when possible, and went about his business. Then word began to spread from neighboring estates, and the coincidence theory became impossible to maintain. In December 1834, a slave catcher named William Dorch disappeared near the Haywood Plantation, 15 miles upriver from Riverbend. Dorch had been tracking a runaway and was last seen near the riverbank in the early evening. His horse was found wandering loose the next morning, but Dorch himself was never located. In January 1835, a traveling merchant named Ambrose Talley, who bought rice from local planters and shipped it to Charleston, was found dead on a back road between 2 plantations. His throat had been cut with precision, but his money, nearly $300 in his saddlebags, was untouched. In February, 2 overseers from neighboring properties vanished within a week of each other, both during evening rounds, both without leaving any trace. By March 1835, plantation owners across the coastal lowlands were meeting in private parlors and offices, behind locked doors, to discuss a problem they couldn't quite articulate. The deaths were too frequent to be coincidence, too methodical to be random, too similar in their execution. Someone, or something, was hunting white men who worked in the slave system, and whoever it was, They knew the land intimately. They knew how to move unseen. They knew when men were vulnerable. They struck with surgical precision and vanished like smoke. That's when the name first began to circulate, though never in official documents. The River Ghost. It wasn't a name that appeared in newspapers. No court document ever referenced it. But in the slave quarters, along the rice fields, in the hidden places where enslaved people spoke in languages their captors couldn't understand, the name took root and spread. The River Ghost. A man who moved like water through the low country, who struck without warning, who killed and vanished, leaving nothing behind but corpses and fear. Some said he could breathe underwater. Others claimed he could become invisible in the fog that rolled off the river every morning. The more superstitious suggested he wasn't human at all, but a spirit of vengeance risen from the swamps. But the older slaves, the ones who'd survived decades of bondage, they knew better. They recognized the work of a human being, someone with extraordinary skill and patience, someone who'd learned to use the very landscape that imprisoned them as a weapon against their captors. And some of them, when they looked at Samuel, quiet Samuel who never spoke unless spoken to, who kept his head down, who seemed to fade into the background, they wondered. The plantation owners responded as men of their class always did. With more violence, more control, more surveillance. They hired additional overseers and armed them with pistols and rifles. They organized patrols that swept through the properties at irregular intervals. They doubled the guards at night. They installed lanterns along property boundaries. They tightened slave codes, restricting movement even further, imposing harsher punishments for infractions. Some plantations instituted passes that slaves had to carry just to move between work areas. Others built higher fences, locked slave quarters at night, conducted random inspections of cabins. None of it mattered. The deaths continued, slow, steady, methodical. A slave catcher in April found with his neck broken at the bottom of a ravine. A plantation manager in June drowned in a creek that was only 2 feet deep. A county sheriff in August, who'd been investigating the killings, discovered dead in his own jail, strangled with what appeared to be a length of rope that had somehow gotten into his locked cell. Each victim was found near water. Each death suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain. Each killing demonstrated patience and planning that seemed almost impossible for a supposedly uneducated slave to possess. By autumn 1835, Thaddeus Claymore was losing sleep. Riverbend had lost 3 overseers in just over a year. Workers were afraid to go near the outer fields after dark. The remaining overseers were demanding higher wages to compensate for the danger. Some were quitting entirely, unwilling to risk their lives no matter the pay. Claymore himself had started carrying a loaded pistol everywhere he went, even inside his own home. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, that something was moving through his property, studying him, waiting for the right moment. On October 15, 1835, Claymore stood on the veranda of his plantation house, staring out at the darkened fields stretching toward the river. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the smell of mud and decaying vegetation. Somewhere in the distance, a heron cried out, a harsh sound that cut through the evening. He thought about Horace Gaffney, face down in the canal. He thought about Benjamin Stokes, who'd simply vanished. He thought about Luther Pettigrew, dragged under the water by something no one could see or explain. He thought about all the other deaths reported from neighboring plantations, the pattern that was becoming impossible to deny. And he thought about Samuel. Samuel, who never caused trouble. Samuel, who worked without complaint. Samuel, who'd been at Riverbend for over 4 years and had never once been punished. Samuel, who knew every inch of the outer fields because he'd been working them since he arrived. Samuel, who'd been assigned to areas near where all 3 overseers had died. Samuel, whose cabin was always neat, whose tools were always in order, who seemed to move through the plantation like he owned it, rather than being owned by it. Claymore had no proof. He had nothing but a growing, gnawing suspicion that tightened in his chest every time he saw Samuel moving through the fields with that calm, deliberate pace. Samuel never looked at him directly, never spoke unless answering a question. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that didn't match his status, that made Claymore deeply uneasy. The next morning, Claymore made a decision. He called his estate manager and ordered Samuel sold. He didn't explain his reasoning. He simply wanted the man gone. Better to be rid of him. Better to let him be someone else's problem. If Claymore was wrong, he'd lost a decent worker. If he was right, and the cold certainty in his gut told him he was, he'd potentially saved his own life. On November 3rd, 1835, Samuel was taken in chains to the Savannah auction house and sold for $750 to a cotton plantation owner named Vincent Hardesty, who operated a large estate in McIntosh County, 60 miles south of River Bend. Samuel stood on the auction block without expression, as Hutchins, the same auctioneer who'd sold him 4 years earlier, described his attributes. Strong, experienced, no health problems. Hardesty examined Samuel's teeth, checked his hands and arms, asked him a few questions in that condescending tone slave owners used when addressing property. Samuel answered quietly, eyes down, the picture of docility. The sale was completed in minutes. Samuel was loaded into a wagon with 4 other purchases and transported south to Hardesty's plantation, a sprawling cotton operation called Fairview that employed 340 enslaved workers. As the wagon rolled away from Savannah, Samuel looked back once at the city, then turned his gaze forward, his face revealing nothing. For 3 months after Samuel's departure, the deaths at River Bend stopped completely. No overseers died. No one vanished. The plantation returned to its normal rhythm of brutal grinding labor without the added terror of mysterious killings. Claymore began to relax. He convinced himself he'd made the right decision. Whatever had been happening, and he still wasn't certain Samuel had been involved, it was over. The river ghost, if such a thing had ever existed, was gone. Then, on February 17, 1836, a slave catcher named Josiah Merrick was found dead in a creek near Hardesty's Fairview plantation. His body bore the same marks that had characterized the deaths along the Savannah River, evidence of drowning in shallow water, bruising consistent with being forcibly held under. The local constable who examined the body noted in his report that the manner of death seemed familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. And in McIntosh County, the killing began again. Over the next 14 years, Samuel was sold 9 more times. Each sale was prompted by a plantation owner's growing unease, a sense that something wasn't right, that the deaths happening on or near their property might somehow be connected to this quiet, unremarkable slave who seemed to notice everything. But none of them could prove anything. Samuel never broke rules, never showed defiance, never gave them legal cause to do anything but sell him. And so he moved steadily southward along the Georgia coast, from one plantation to another, leaving behind a trail of corpses that authorities struggled to explain. The pattern was remarkable in its consistency. Samuel would arrive at a new property, work without incident for a few months, integrating himself into the plantation's rhythm, learning the layout, the routines, the personalities. Then men would start dying. Never immediately. Never in ways that could be directly traced back to Samuel, but consistently, methodically, overseers who were particularly cruel. Slave catchers who operated in the area. Merchants who profited from the system. Constables who enforced the slave codes with excessive zeal. They died in accidents that weren't quite accidents. They vanished without explanation. They drowned in water that shouldn't have been deep enough to drown in. They fell from places they shouldn't have fallen from. They were found with injuries that didn't match the official explanations. And always near water. Rivers, creeks, canals, swamps, marshes. The river ghost earned his name honestly because he seemed to use water itself as a weapon. In 1837, Samuel was at a turpentine operation near Darien, where enslaved workers carved diagonal cuts into pine trees and collected the resin in buckets. The work was different from rice cultivation, but no less brutal. The caustic sap burned skin, the long hours in the pine forests were isolating, and the overseers were known for their violence. The camp's head overseer, a man named Raymond Colquitt, was particularly notorious. He'd reportedly killed at least 2 enslaved workers over the years, beatings that had gone too far, bodies buried without ceremony in unmarked graves among the pines. Samuel arrived at the camp in June 1837. By August, Colquitt was dead, his body found at the base of a longleaf pine, his skull fractured, his hickory cane lying beside him in the pine needles. The official report stated he'd fallen from the scaffolding workers used to reach the higher cuts on the trees. But the other enslaved workers at the camp knew better. They'd seen Samuel watching Colquitt. They'd noticed the way Samuel studied the man's routines where he walked when he was alone. They'd seen Samuel disappear into the forest one evening and return an hour later, calm and expressionless. One worker, a man named Abram who'd been at the camp for 5 years, later told a story to his grandchildren decades after emancipation. He said he'd followed Samuel that night, curious, keeping his distance in the darkness beneath the pines. He watched Samuel walk directly to a specific area of the forest where Colquitt often inspected the work alone. Samuel had prepared everything in advance, loosened bolts on the scaffolding, weakened support beams, created a trap that would only spring under the weight of a full-grown man in exactly the right location. When Colquitt had climbed up the next morning to inspect the cuts, the scaffolding had given way, sending him plummeting 20 feet to the ground. The fall hadn't killed him immediately. Colquitt had lain there, gasping, his back broken. But Samuel had been nearby, waiting. He'd approached, looked down at the dying overseer, and said something Abram couldn't hear. Then Samuel had walked away, leaving Colquitt to die slowly among the pine trees. Abram never reported what he'd seen. None of the workers did. Because in the slave quarters, Samuel wasn't a murderer. He was something else entirely. He was proof that the system could bleed, that the men who thought themselves invulnerable could die, that justice, even rough and terrible justice, was possible. In 1839, Samuel was sold to a rice plantation on Edisto Island, South Carolina. In 1841, to a cotton estate near Brunswick, Georgia. In 1843, back to another rice plantation in the Savannah area. Each time, the pattern repeated. A few months of quiet, then provided information that led to the river ghost's capture. It was as if an entire population had collectively decided that whatever was happening, whoever was responsible, deserved their protection more than they deserved their oppressors' money or mercy. In 1851, something changed in the pattern. Samuel, if that was even his real name anymore, surfaced briefly in Florida. A plantation ledger from a property near Jacksonville records the purchase of field hand, tall, middle-aged, answering to Samuel, purchased from estate sale in Georgia, $800. He was there for less than a year. During that time, 4 men died. 2 overseers known for their cruelty, a slave catcher who specialized in tracking runaways through the Florida wetlands, and a local constable who'd made a name for himself by brutally suppressing any hint of resistance among the enslaved population. All 4 deaths occurred near water. All 4 were ruled accidents or unexplained incidents. Then Samuel disappeared again. This time he stayed gone for nearly 3 years. Some people began to hope he'd died, that the river ghost had finally met his end somewhere in the vast wilderness of the southern swamps. But others, particularly those in the enslaved communities, believed he was still out there, perhaps hiding, perhaps resting, perhaps simply waiting for the right moment to resume his work. When the trail picked up again in 1854, it was farther north, back in South Carolina near Beaufort. A rice planter named Edmund Hargrave wrote in a private letter to a friend, "There is a man working my lower fields who unnerves me. He is older than most of my hands, yet he moves with a vitality that seems unnatural for his age. He speaks to no one. He watches everything. I have sold men before for less cause than the feeling he gives me, yet I cannot spare the labor during harvest season. I shall be glad when the season ends, and I can be rid of him. 3 months after writing that letter, Hargrave was found dead in one of his own rice fields, drowned in water that barely covered his ankles. The circumstances were impossible to explain rationally. A healthy man in broad daylight drowning in such shallow water? The official report struggled to provide an explanation, finally settling on the vague suggestion that Hargrave might have suffered a seizure or heart attack that caused him to fall face first into the water and remain there until he suffocated. But everyone who read the report knew it was inadequate. They knew what had really happened, even if they couldn't prove it. By 1860, the United States was fracturing. The debate over slavery had reached a boiling point. Northern abolitionists and Southern plantation owners were locked in a political battle that was pushing the nation towards civil war. Southern states were threatening secession. Plantation owners were fortifying their properties, forming militias, preparing for armed conflict. The entire system of Southern slavery, which had seemed so permanent and immovable, was beginning to show cracks. But even in the midst of that growing chaos, even as the nation teetered on the brink of war, the deaths continued. If anything, they accelerated. Overseers, slave catchers, particularly brutal plantation owners, men whose names had appeared in abolitionist newspapers as examples of the system's cruelty, began dying at an alarming rate. Some attributed it to rising tensions, to violence spilling over from the national conflict. But those who'd been tracking the pattern for decades knew better. The river ghost was still hunting, and he showed no signs of stopping. Then, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the South went to war with the North. Everything changed overnight. Plantations were emptied as white men left to join the Confederate Army. Overseers became soldiers. Slave patrols dissolved as their members rode off to fight. The entire infrastructure that had maintained the system of slavery began to crumble under the weight of war. For 4 years, the South was consumed by the bloodiest conflict in American history, with over 600,000 men dying on battlefields from Virginia to Texas. In that chaos, tracking the deaths attributed to the river ghost became nearly impossible. With so many men dying in battle, who could say which deaths were acts of war and which were something else? The careful records that had been kept in previous decades, plantation ledgers, death certificates, court investigations, largely ceased. The system that had documented Samuel's movements through property sales and transfers collapsed entirely. But Confederate military correspondence, preserved now in the National Archives, tells a fascinating story. In 1863, a Confederate colonel named Marcus Talbot wrote to his commanding officer in Richmond, describing what he called a persistent problem among the supply lines in coastal Georgia. Talbot reported that over 6 months, more than 20 Confederate soldiers, pickets, sentries, and couriers had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The deaths occurred in remote areas, always near water, always when men were isolated and vulnerable. The men are convinced, Talbot wrote, that one of the local Negroes is responsible, though they cannot identify him. They have given him a name, the River Ghost. The colored people will not speak of him even under threat of punishment. Some of my soldiers believe he is a myth, a story invented to frighten them. But I have seen the bodies, sir, and I tell you the deaths are real. The men believe this individual has been killing white men for 30 years, perhaps longer, and no one has ever stopped him. It affects morale. Some of my men refuse to stand sentry duty alone near the rivers. They see shadows in the water and believe death itself is coming for them. Talbot requested permission to organize a dedicated manhunt to pull men from combat duty and focus them on finding and eliminating this threat. But his commanding officer denied the request. The Confederacy was losing the war. Union forces were advancing through Georgia. Resources were stretched impossibly thin. A few dead soldiers in the coastal lowlands weren't a priority when entire armies were being destroyed in battles at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. Talbot's letter was filed away and forgotten, and so the River Ghost continued his work, moving through a landscape transformed by war, killing Confederate soldiers the same way he'd killed overseers and slave catchers, with the same patience, the same precision, the same complete absence of mercy. By the time General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, effectively ending the Civil War, the estimated death toll attributed to the River Ghost, if the fragmentary records could be believed, had surpassed 200 white men. And still, he had never been caught, never been identified with absolute certainty, never left behind enough evidence to even confirm his existence beyond rumor and whispered stories. After the war, during the period called Reconstruction, the trail went completely cold. With the abolition of slavery, the entire system that had documented the movement and sale of enslaved people collapsed. There were no more plantation ledgers tracking Samuel's whereabouts, no more auctions, no more overseers to report suspicious deaths. The newly freed black population scattered across the South, seeking separated family members, looking for work, trying to build new lives in a devastated landscape where former slaves and former masters now had to find ways to coexist. And somewhere in that great migration, Samuel, if he'd survived the war, simply disappeared into history. The killings that had characterized his movement through the coastal lowlands ceased. The name River Ghost faded from memory, at least among white populations. It became just another piece of Southern folklore, a scary story, one of dozens of legends about the dark days of slavery. But in the Gullah communities of the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, among the descendants of enslaved people who'd worked the rice plantations and turpentine camps, the story survived. It was passed down through generations, told in Gullah, in whispers, in coded language that outsiders couldn't fully understand. And in those tellings, the River Ghost wasn't a monster. He was a hero. A man who'd fought back when fighting back meant certain death. A man who'd used the weapons available to him, the land, the water, his knowledge, his patience, to wage a private war against a system that had tried to crush him. There's one final story, never verified, passed down orally through a small Gullah community on St. Helena Island, South Carolina. It may be true. It may be embellishment. It may be complete fiction. But it offers a possible ending to the River Ghost's story, and for that reason, it deserves to be told. The story goes like this. In the summer of 1877, 12 years after the end of the war, an old man arrived in a small freedmen's settlement near Beaufort. He was tall but stooped with age, his hair white, his face deeply lined, his hands gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of brutal labor. He walked with the slight stiffness of someone whose body had been pushed far beyond its limits for far too long. He came on foot, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bundle containing a blanket and a wooden bowl. The settlement was one of dozens that had formed after the war, places where formerly enslaved people tried to build communities on land they'd worked but never owned. This particular settlement consisted of about 40 families, farming small plots, fishing in the creeks, trying to survive in the difficult years of Reconstruction. They welcomed the old man cautiously. Stranger arrivals had to be treated carefully, as many freed people were still vulnerable to violence from white supremacist groups that roamed the South. The old man didn't give his name. When asked, he simply said, "Call me whatever you like. Names don't matter much anymore." He found an empty cabin at the edge of the settlement, a small structure that had been abandoned when its previous occupant died. He moved in without asking permission, and no one objected. The cabin needed repairs, and within a week, the old man had fixed the roof, patched the walls, and made the place livable. He kept to himself. He didn't attend the community gatherings. He didn't go to the church services that were held every Sunday in a building the community had constructed themselves. He didn't socialize or tell stories about where he'd been or what he'd seen. He simply tended a small garden behind his cabin, fished in the nearby creeks, and lived quietly. The other residents respected his privacy, though some of the younger people found him strange and unsettling. There was something about the way he moved, even in old age, that suggested coiled power. Something about his eyes that suggested he'd seen things that couldn't be spoken aloud. Months passed. The old man became part of the settlement's landscape, accepted but not integrated, present but separate. Then one warm evening in late summer, a group of younger men were sitting around a fire in the settlement's central area, talking about the old days. One of them, a man in his 30s named Isaiah, mentioned a plantation where he'd been enslaved as a child, a brutal place where the overseer had been notorious for his cruelty. "I remember his name," Isaiah said. "Thaddeus Claymore. He owned the place, had about 260 of us working his rice fields. He acted like he was better than other slave owners, like he treated us well. But his overseers were devils. 3 of them died while I was there, and Claymore would just hire new ones. Never seemed to care why they kept dying." From across the fire, in the shadows beyond the light, the old man's voice spoke clearly. Claymore drowned in 1852, fell into one of his own rice canals during harvest season. They said it was an accident, that he'd slipped on the muddy bank and hit his head. By the time they pulled him out, he'd been underwater for over 20 minutes. He was buried in the Plantations cemetery, in the section reserved for white people, with a nice stone marker. Everyone turned to look at the old man. He'd stepped closer to the fire, his face partially illuminated by the flames. Isaiah stared at him. "How do you know that? That plantation was up in Georgia, near Savannah. Were you there?" The old man smiled, a strange, distant expression that suggested memories of things both terrible and satisfying. "I was there," he said quietly. "I was standing right next to the canal when it happened. In fact, you might say I helped him fall." The silence around the fire was absolute. Everyone understood what the old man was implying, but no one knew how to respond. Isaiah opened his mouth to ask another question, but the old man had already turned away. He walked back toward his cabin, disappearing into the darkness, and no one followed him. After that night, the old man never spoke of his past again. He lived in the settlement for another 6 years, keeping to his quiet routine, bothering no one, contributing when he could. The younger residents continued to find him unsettling, but the older people, the ones who'd lived through slavery, who carried their own scars and memories, they treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence. They understood, even if they never spoke of it directly, who he might be, what he might have done, the role he might have played in that dark history. In 1883, on a humid July night, the old man died peacefully in his sleep. He was discovered the next morning by a neighbor who'd come to check on him when he didn't appear at his usual time. There was no drama to his death, no final words, no revelation of secrets. He simply passed away, his body finally giving out after what must have been 75 or 80 years of life, most of it spent in bondage. The settlement buried him in their small cemetery, in a grave marked only by a simple wooden cross with no name carved into it. Several dozen people attended the funeral, more than would typically come for a man who'd been so private and solitary. They sang hymns, they said prayers, they spoke about the dignity of all lives, about the struggles they'd all endured, about the hope that future generations would live in a better world. And after the funeral, when most people had returned to their homes, 3 very old women stood by the grave, looking down at the fresh earth. They were among the oldest residents of the settlement, all of them over 70, all of them bearing the marks of lives spent in slavery. They didn't speak for a long time. Then one of them, a woman named Esther who'd been born on a rice plantation in Georgia, said quietly, "He was the river ghost, wasn't he?" The other 2 women didn't answer directly, but one of them, whose name was Dinah, said, "Whoever he was, he did what he had to do. He survived, and he made some of them pay for what they did to us. That's all that matters." The third woman, Rebecca, nodded slowly. "Some stories," she said, "ain't meant to be told complete. Some stories are better left with questions at the end." Let the white folks wonder. Let them ask themselves if it was real or not. Let them feel a little bit of what we felt all those years, not knowing, being afraid, wondering when something might come out of the darkness for them. They stood there for a few more minutes, then turned and walked back toward the settlement, leaving the nameless man in his nameless grave, taking their knowledge with them to their own graves in the years that followed. The truth is, we may never know with absolute certainty who Samuel really was. We may never know if the river ghost was one man or many, real or legend, fact or folktale embellished through decades of retelling. The historical record is too fragmentary, too compromised by the inherent injustices of a system that treated human beings as property and therefore didn't bother to document their lives in any meaningful way. We have plantation ledgers that record sales. We have death certificates that record casualties. We have private letters and court documents that reference mysterious deaths. We have oral histories passed down through Gullah communities. But we don't have definitive proof. Some historians argue that the river ghost was a collective creation, a story that enslaved communities told themselves to maintain hope, to believe that resistance was possible, that their oppressors could be made to feel fear. They suggest that the deaths attributed to one man were actually the work of many, desperate individuals, resistance cells, people who independently decided to fight back and whose actions were later woven into a single narrative. It's a compelling theory, one that acknowledges the reality that resistance to slavery took many forms, most of them small, hidden, and unrecorded. But other historians, particularly those who've carefully studied the pattern of deaths, the geographic progression, the consistency of method, believe there really was a Samuel, a man who was sold at that auction in Savannah in 1831, who learned to use the landscape of the coastal lowlands as a weapon, who developed an expertise in moving unseen, in striking precisely at moments of vulnerability, in killing people in ways that looked like accidents or could be attributed to natural causes, who spent 3 decades waging a private war against a system that had enslaved him, methodically eliminating the men who enforced that system, never seeking glory or recognition, simply doing what he believed needed to be done. What's undeniable is that the deaths happened. The records exist. Between 1834 and approximately 1865, over 200 white men involved in the slave system, overseers, slave catchers, plantation owners, merchants, law enforcement officers, died under suspicious circumstances in the coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina. Many of those deaths shared common characteristics: proximity to water, no witnesses, methods that suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain, victims who'd been particularly cruel or visible in their enforcement of slavery. And despite extensive investigations, despite enormous rewards, despite the deployment of significant law enforcement resources, no one was ever arrested or convicted for those deaths. And perhaps most tellingly, the enslaved communities of the region, who collectively must have known far more than they ever revealed, maintained absolute silence. Not a single enslaved person, despite everything they had to gain from cooperation with authorities, ever provided information that led to the capture of the river ghost. That silence itself is a historical fact, one that speaks volumes about who these communities believed deserved their loyalty and protection. The story of the river ghost, whether he was one man named Samuel or many men whose actions were combined in memory, shows us that the history we think we know is often incomplete. That there are stories buried in forgotten archives, preserved in oral traditions, hidden just beneath the surface of the official narrative. That the people who were deemed property, who were denied names and identities and histories, nevertheless found ways to act, to resist, to fight back. That even in the most oppressive system imaginable, some people refused to be broken. And it reminds us that justice, when denied through legal channels, when corrupted by systems designed to benefit the powerful, sometimes takes other forms. Forms that history may never fully document. Forms that remain ambiguous, mysterious, wrapped in legend and rumor. Forms that make the comfortable uncomfortable, that force people who benefit from injustice to look over their shoulders, to wonder if they're being watched, to feel a fraction of the fear they inflict on others. What do you think of this story? Do you believe one man could have evaded capture for 30 years, killing over 200 people without ever being caught? Or was the river ghost something more? A symbol, a collective act of resistance, a story that communities told themselves to survive unbearable circumstances. Do you think Samuel died peacefully in that freedmen's settlement in 1883? Or did he disappear into the swamps decades earlier, becoming part of the landscape he knew so well? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling and want more deep dives into the hidden histories of America, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that